He broke into the barn for a horse and a way out. What he found instead were 2 newborns swaddled in rags, left to freeze. He hadn't come to save anyone. But some things don't let a man walk away. The wind had teeth that night. It came down off the hills in long snarls, sharp enough to peel skin. Cal Redding pulled his coat tighter and crept through the snowdrift toward the barn, one hand on the butt of the pistol tucked in his waistband, the other gripping the rusted lock he'd already broken. The moon gave him just enough light to see the outlines of the wooden planks. The pitch of the roof weighed heavy with snow. He didn't care if someone inside heard him. If they had a horse, it'd be his come morning. Cal didn't know whose land this was, and didn't much care. He'd been riding cold for 2 days since that mess in Abner's Bluff. Riding alone, hungry, with blood still drying in patches on his sleeves from the last town that didn't take kindly to outlaws. He was tired of losing, tired of running. He just wanted a horse to get him south. That was it. The barn creaked as he slipped inside. Hay scattered the floor in patches, mostly frozen, and the stench of manure mixed with old iron and frost. His boots cracked ice with every step. He didn't bother lighting a match. He knew how to feel his way through shadows, knew the outline of a saddle, the shape of reins, the warmth of breath on his hand from a drowsy mare. But there was no snort, no hoofbeat, just silence, until he heard it. A sound so faint he thought it was the wind at first, then again, more insistent, a soft whimper, muffled, fragile. He froze. It came from behind a stack of old feed sacks. Cal moved toward it cautiously, thinking maybe a dog, or worse, some dying animal stuck inside. But when he pulled the sack away, the breath locked in his throat. 2. Not 1. 2 tiny bundles in a cracked old basket swaddled in warm blankets already crusted with frost around the edges. Their skin was nearly blue, lips pale. One cried, barely. The other didn't make a sound. And their eyes that hadn't been open long to this world, were searching the dark for something that wasn't there. Cal's first instinct was to walk away. This wasn't his fight. He didn't ask for this. He needed a horse, not a reason to freeze to death with infants who didn't belong to him. But something in the pit of his stomach refused to let him move. The same something that had kept him from shooting that deputy, clean back in Coleridge. The same something that kept him awake nights, remembering faces he couldn't fix. They were too cold. That much was clear. If he didn't do something now, one or both of them wouldn't make it another hour. He knelt, pulling the blankets tighter, then lifted the basket, surprised by how light it was, how small they felt. One of the girls whimpered again, but softer now. Her twin still hadn't made a sound. He backed out of the barn, wind biting, through his coat again. The farmhouse loomed in the dark across the yard, lightless. No smoke from the chimney, dead quiet, either abandoned or something worse. He didn't knock. Cal kicked the door open and stepped inside with the basket in. His arms, the place was cold as a tomb, floorboards frozen stiff. The fire long gone out. He moved through the front room slowly, half expecting a shotgun, half hoping someone, anyone, was still alive inside. But the house was empty. He found a bedroom with a half-collapsed bed and a patchwork quilt still folded at the foot. He set the twins down, wrapped them tighter in it, and struck a match to find the hearth. The fireplace hadn't been used in days. He gathered what dry wood he could from a kindling box in the corner and lit it with trembling fingers. It took effort. The first flame almost died, but then it caught, and heat began to crawl through the cold like something living again. He looked at the girls. One had opened her eyes, dark, wide, and filled with a kind of silent question that pierced him harder than any bullet ever had. Callie had been called many things in his life: thief, liar, killer on occasion. He'd never been called father, never wanted to be. He didn't even know if he could keep them alive through the night. But he wasn't about to leave them. He searched the kitchen and found a few tins, mostly beans, spoiled pears, and stale bread. Nothing a baby could eat. Then he opened a cabinet and found something strange. Bottles, lined up neatly, labelled, milk substitute, handwritten with dates, cloth diapers in a stack. Someone had prepared for them. Someone had left them, but not without trying to help them survive. That made it worse somehow. He sat on the floor next to the fire, cradling one of the babies in his arms, feeding her as best he could. She was too weak to cry now, but she swallowed the milk with slow, shaky gulps. The other hadn't moved. Cal panicked. He touched her forehead, cold but not lifeless. He rubbed her back gently, whispering words he didn't know he remembered. And then she moved. A hiccup, then a gasp. Her tiny mouth opened in a soundless wail. Relief hit him so hard he nearly dropped her. He'd never cared much for miracles, but in that moment, it felt like he'd witnessed one. The wind howled harder outside, slamming snow against the windows. But inside, the fire cracked, warm. And Cal Redding, who'd come to steal a horse, found himself instead sitting guard over two lives that had no one else left in the world. He didn't sleep. He didn't dare. Not when dawn might bring whoever left them behind, or worse, whoever was supposed to come collect. Morning didn't arrive gentle. It came clawing through the frost, dragging colour back into the world, one painful inch at a time. The storm had buried the yard in white, glazed the fence rails, sealed the barn door shut with a crust of ice. And still, Cal Redding hadn't slept. He sat slumped in the rocking chair by the hearth. The fire nothing more than red coals now. His coat draped across both girls, who lay bundled inside the quilt like fragile cargo. One stirred occasionally, little sighs, a twitch of fingers. The other was quieter, but her colour had returned. That alone had kept Cal upright, fighting, off the weight behind his eyes. Something about watching them sleep kept his lungs moving. He didn't know how old they were. Days, maybe. But not more than that. They were too small, their arms no thicker than his fingers. Their faces were still soft, undefined. Tiny strangers dumped into a world with no name, no claim, and no future. Cal had a dozen reasons to leave. The storm had passed, meaning travel was possible again. He could have taken the mare he finally found hidden in the rear of the barn, tethered behind bales, nose buried in hay, and been halfway to Toller Ridge by noon. There were places a man like him could vanish. Places with no law, no questions. But he didn't leave. Instead, he pulled the chair closer to the fire, fed the last few sticks of dry wood into the hearth, and thought through his options like a man trapped between floods. He needed help. That was the plain truth. Someone who knew what to do with babies. He couldn't ride with them. Not in this cold. Not without supplies. He needed town, which meant he needed to be seen. And that was the part that didn't sit right. There were wanted posters with his name on them, not 3 counties over. Cal hadn't spilled innocent blood, but the law didn't always measure right and wrong the way decent folks did. They remembered headlines, robbery at Pitchfork Station, standoff outside Goldwater Gulch, and Cal's name, misspelled but clear, etched beneath every black ink sketch nailed to tavern walls. He stood finally, stiff from hours of stillness, and crossed to the front window. The glass was fogged from the fire's heat, but beyond it he could just make out the tracks he'd left the night before. No new prints, no horses, no boots. Whoever had left the twins hadn't come back, but someone would. Cal could feel it, like the slow coil of trouble winding up behind every hour of silence. He walked through the house again, this time with intention. He took inventory of what was usable: 3 clean bottles, half a tin of formula, 2 more blankets, 1 oil lamp, mostly full, a small revolver, unloaded, rusted, from the nightstand in the master bedroom. He tucked it into his coat anyway. Some weapons were worth more for how they made a man look. He fed the girls again, careful not to rush. Then he cleaned what he could, wrapped them tight, and packed the quilt around them in the same basket. He knew the snow wouldn't make travel easy, but if he waited another day, he might not get another chance. Just as he was about to step out, he paused. There was a picture on the mantel he hadn't seen before. Two faces, a man and a woman, side by side. The woman held an infant in her arms. The man wore a deputy's badge. The photograph was faded at the corners, but it was recent enough, and beneath it, scratched into the wood of the frame, were 3 initials. JMW. Cal stared a long while before tucking the picture into his satchel. Then he lifted the basket and pushed the door open, the wind tugging at his coat like claws. He trudged through the snow, headed east along the fence line. The trail would eventually lead toward Hollow Creek, a small settlement barely marked on maps. He knew it from old jobs, half-remembered routes. It wasn't much, just a church, a mill, a trading post, and a sheriff who kept mostly to himself. But if Cal played it right, he might be able to leave the girls in trusted hands before anyone thought to ask his name. The mare followed easily. She was slow but steady, and he led her by the reins rather than ride. The basket rested in the saddle, secure beneath blankets. Every few minutes, Cal would glance down to check on them. The first time, one had fallen asleep again. The second, both eyes were open, blinking up at him like they'd known him forever. It made something twist in his chest. By midday, the sky was flat grey, and the cold had settled into his bones. But Hollow Creek came into view over a small ridge, smoke from chimneys, tiny roofs half buried in snow. It looked like safety, or something close to it. Cal didn't go straight to the sheriff's office. He wasn't stupid. He stopped first at the church. It stood at the edge of town, small and crooked, with a whitewashed steeple that looked like it hadn't seen paint in years. But the cross stood proud above it, and Cal figured if there was one place that would take in 2 lost girls without asking too many questions, it'd be there. He knocked with his elbow. A moment passed, then the door opened, and a woman in her 50s looked out. Stern face, hair tied back in a tight braid, eyes like ice water. She took one look at the basket and stepped aside without a word. Inside was warm, dim, but clean. Cal set the basket on a pew near the front and pulled the blankets back. They were left in a barn, he said simply. The woman didn't respond right away. She knelt, examining them gently, hands careful. She checked their temperature, their breathing, the look in their eyes. Then she stood and looked at Cal. "And you?" she asked. "You find them?" "I did." "You their father?" "No." "Running from something?" Cal didn't answer. She studied him a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "They'll need milk and blankets and someone watching them day and night. I'll stay. I'll help." She raised a brow. "That ain't what I expected to hear. Wasn't what I expected to say." The woman introduced herself as Sister Lenora. She was no nun, she clarified. Just someone who stayed after the last preacher left. She tended to orphans, travelers, the sick and the lost. She didn't ask many questions, but the ones she did ask, she expected answers to. Cal told her only what he had to, that he'd found them abandoned, that he hadn't hurt anyone to get here, that he didn't intend to stay longer than he was welcome. But as night fell again, and the wind came back louder through the eaves, Cal found himself still there, by the fire, feeding the girls, warming their hands with his own. Then the door burst open, not with wind, not with storm, but with boots. 3 men, coats thick with dust, hands close to pistols, eyes hard. The one in front wore a badge. Cal didn't stand, didn't reach for anything, just looked at them and waited. The sheriff's voice was calm. Too calm. "We got a report from the Hollow, Ridge Trail. Said a stranger came through, matching a description from up north. Someone who might have been involved in a robbery, might have left some bodies behind." "I didn't kill nobody," Cal said evenly. "Didn't say you did. Yet." Sister Lenora stepped between them. He brought 2 orphan girls into this church, saved their lives. If he's guilty of something else, you can prove it later. But not tonight. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded once. We'll talk come morning. And just like that, the door closed again. Cal let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He looked down at the girls, both asleep now, heads tilted, toward each other, cheeks warm from the firelight. Trouble wasn't done with him, not by a long shot, but maybe, for tonight, he'd done something that mattered. The church was cold in the morning. Not because the fire had died, Cal had kept it going through the night, but because of what waited outside. Silence had returned to Hollow Creek, the kind that presses against windows and sits too long in corners. A silence that said someone, somewhere, was deciding what came next. The girls were still asleep when Sister Lenora brought in a small pot of porridge and a pitcher of milk warmed on the stove. She handed Cal a tin cup, but didn't speak for a long time. Instead, she watched him feed the girls again, slower now, with practiced hands. He'd gotten better at it. Quicker, more careful. He didn't spill as much, didn't panic when one started to cry. It was strange how fast something like that became second nature. But when life hangs in the balance, you learn. You adapt. You don't strike me as the kind of man who stays in one place, she finally said. I'm not. She nodded, as if she'd known the answer before asking. But you're still here. Cal didn't respond. He hadn't slept. Not really. Every creak of the floorboards had pulled his eyes open. Every gust of wind against the shutters felt like it might bring boots and questions. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to run. Not without knowing what would happen to the girls. Not without being sure they'd be safe. They have names, she asked. No. Well, that's not right. She looked down at the 2 of them, still bundled tight in the basket near the fire. You name a thing, you give it meaning, she said softly. You give it a place. People don't care what. They lose if it doesn't have a name. Cal stared at them. One had dark hair, just a whisper of it, and a crease in her brow like she was always about to scowl. The other had lighter skin, softer features. Cal thought for a long moment, then cleared his throat. Lydia, he said finally, nodding to the dark-haired one. And the other? Rose. Lydia and Rose, Lenora echoed. That'll do. There was something in her tone, approval maybe, but she didn't push the moment, just stood and returned to her kitchen, leaving Cal with the girls and the sound of the snow shifting outside. But peace wasn't built to last. The sheriff came back that afternoon. He wasn't alone this time. 2 other men rode with him, both in long coats, rifles slung low, eyes sharp. They didn't come in shooting, but they didn't look like they came for a conversation either. Cal stepped outside to meet them before they could reach the church door. Snow crunched beneath his boots, and the wind tugged at the edges of his coat. He didn't carry a weapon, didn't even pretend to be a threat. That was part of the gamble. Name? The sheriff asked, though his eyes said he already knew. Cal Redding. The men behind the sheriff exchanged glances. One whispered something too low to catch. Been a long time since your name came through here, the sheriff said. Some folks in Clearwater remember it different than you probably do. I didn't kill nobody, Cal said again. That what you said last time? No. Last time I said I didn't mean to. The sheriff studied him. Snow flurries spun between them. Behind Cal, the door to the church creaked, but he didn't turn. He knew Lenora was watching. Why are you here? The sheriff asked. I found 2 girls in a barn, newborns, tied up like cattle on a cold night. I wasn't looking to be a hero, wasn't looking to stay. But I couldn't leave them there. You steal the horse too? I did. You always this honest? Only when I'm too tired to lie. The sheriff let out a breath, not quite a sigh. Then he nodded to his men, and they eased off their reins a bit. I can't promise to ignore your name, the sheriff said. But Hollow Creek ain't the kind of place that hangs men just for being known. You keep quiet. You don't cause trouble. You help Sister Lenora keep those girls alive. Maybe we forget about Clearwater for a while." Cal nodded. "That's fair." The sheriff turned his horse. "For now, you stay near the church. If you try to run, we'll ride." "I understand." And then they left. No cuffs, no orders. Just a warning in the shape of kindness. Cal watched them disappear down the snow-covered road before stepping back inside. Lenora met his eyes and gave a small, sharp nod. "You're either very lucky," she said, "or someone up there's giving you a second chance." "I've had chances," he muttered. "Maybe this one counts more." That night, the storm returned. Not outside, but inside Cal's mind. He sat by the fire with Lydia and Rose asleep again and tried to forget the things that always crawled, back when it got too quiet. Faces he'd seen in alleys, the thundering of hooves, the feel of blood on his coat that wasn't his own. He hadn't always been a bad man, but he'd done things that stuck. Things that made people cross the street when they saw his shadow. He'd never laid a hand on the innocent, but that didn't mean he hadn't helped build the kind of fires that burned lives down. But these girls, they were clean slates. They didn't know him, didn't flinch at his voice. They cried when they were hungry, not when he reached for them, and that alone made something shift inside him. He wasn't used to being needed, and that's what scared him most. The next morning, Sister Lenora handed him a folded sheet of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "Supplies. There's a trader, south of here. You tell him I sent you, and he'll hand you what we need. Formula, cloth, medicine if we're lucky. South's a full day's ride." "I know. That's why you should leave now." Cal looked down at the list. It wasn't long, but every word felt heavier than the last. He wasn't scared of riding alone, wasn't even scared of being recognized. But he didn't want to leave them. Not Lydia and Rose. Not for a day. Not even for an hour. "They'll be safe," Lenora said, sensing the hesitation. "I've seen worse things than a former outlaw trying to do right. And if someone comes looking, I'll lie through my teeth to protect them." "That's a promise," Cal nodded. It was the best offer he'd get. He saddled the mare, packed the list, and left at first light. The road south was harder than expected. The storm had layered ice beneath fresh snow, and the mare nearly slipped more than once. But Cal kept on, watching the horizon, checking his back trail every half hour. He wasn't sure who he expected to see. A bounty hunter, an old enemy, maybe just his past riding up to collect. The trading post came into view around dusk. Just a long cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, a corral out back, and an old bell hanging over the porch. He dismounted, knocked twice, and waited. Door opened slowly. A tall man with a broad chest and a crooked nose stared back. "Can I help you?" "I need supplies," Cal said. "For 2 newborns. Sister Lenora sent me." The man's expression didn't change, but he opened the door wider. Inside, the air smelled like tobacco and whiskey. Cal handed over the list and waited as the man gathered what he could. Half a bag of formula, 2 clean bottles, a small jar of liniment. Not much, but more than nothing. $20, the man said. Cal froze. He had 5. But before he could answer, a voice rang out from the corner. "That him?" Cal turned. A woman stood by the stove. Thin, sharp-eyed, with a pistol in her apron. "That's the one from Clearwater," she said. Cal didn't reach for his gun. Didn't move at all. "I didn't come here for trouble," he said. "No," the woman replied. "But trouble follows you just the same." The trader looked between them. "He's with the church now. Sister Lenora wouldn't send a killer. She sent a man who stole a horse," the woman snapped. "What else he done?" Cal didn't defend himself. Didn't have to. Because, at that moment, a second knock came at the door. Heavy. Urgent. The trader moved to open it, but Cal grabbed his arm. "Wait!" Too late. The door flew open. A man stood in the snow. Coat torn, hat missing, blood on his temple. Behind him, smoke curled into the sky. It's the church, he gasped. It's burning. Someone set it on fire, and there's still people inside. Cal's heart stopped. He didn't wait. He grabbed the supplies, mounted the mare, and rode like death itself was snapping at his heels. The road back felt longer. Every mile was ice and panic. He couldn't see the sky for the clouds, couldn't feel his hands for the cold. But he rode, and he prayed, not out loud, not in words, but in the way a man does when he has nothing else left to give. When Hollow Creek came into view, the smoke was still rising. The church was half collapsed, flames curling through broken rafters. People gathered in the snow, buckets in hand, shouting, crying, and Sister Lenora, bloodied, coughing, was kneeling near the steps. He dropped from the horse and ran to her. "Where are they?" he shouted. Her eyes met his, red, wet. "I got one out," she whispered. "One. The other, still inside." Cal didn't think. He ran into the fire. The heat inside the church wasn't just fire. It was fury. Smoke clawed down his throat and clawed up into his eyes, and the wood underfoot groaned like it was ready to collapse. But none of that mattered. Not to Cal. Not when he knew Rose was still inside. He didn't have time to think. Just moved. Pushed past the shattered pews, the blackened hymnals still smouldering on the floor, past the pulpit that had once held Sister Lenora's quiet voice, in prayer, and now held only smoke. The ceiling had already given way above the choir loft, and flames poured through the gash like some awful wound. He swore he heard crying over it. Just faint, just enough to snap something deep in his chest. He found her in the back room. The fire hadn't touched the cradle yet, but it was licking closer with every second. She was screaming now, mouth wide and red, fists flailing at the smoky air, like she was fighting for her life, which, in a way, she was. Cal didn't hesitate. He snatched her from the cradle and shielded her with his coat, turned his back to the fire and ran. The floor cracked behind him, the ceiling gave a groan and spit sparks as a beam fell, but it missed him by inches. By grace, maybe. By sheer, dumb luck. Or maybe because he didn't let go of that child, not even once. He burst out into the snow, gasping, clutching Rose to his chest. She was still crying, which was good. Crying meant breathing. Lenora was there, crawling toward him. Her face was covered in soot, her lips split, one eye already swelling shut. But she reached for Rose like her own soul depended on it. Cal handed the child off and sank to his knees in the snow, coughing hard, eyes watering. "She's alive," Lenora sobbed, clutching the girl to her. "Oh Lord, she's alive!" The townsfolk gathered close, silent now, watching Cal like they weren't sure what to make of him anymore. A thief, a murderer, or something else, something in between. The sheriff arrived moments later, riding hard, his coat flapping behind him. He leapt off the horse before it had even stopped moving. "What happened?" "Arson," said one of the men nearby. "Somebody set the church ablaze." "Anyone see who?" No one answered. There were too many faces, too much smoke, too much chaos. The sheriff turned to Cal. "You were gone." "I went to get supplies," Cal said. His voice was hoarse, the smoke still thick in his lungs. "For the girls. Ask Lenora. I brought back what I could." The sheriff didn't speak for a long time, just looked at the man in front of him, coated in ash, burned along one arm, face blistered at the temple, coat torn from shielding a baby. "You ran into a burning building for a child." "I did." "Not many men do that. Maybe I'm trying to be something better." The sheriff nodded once, then looked to his deputy. "Get the townsfolk moving, rebuild crew, water buckets, tools, and someone help Sister Lenora get those girls someplace warm." They took Rose and Lydia to the schoolhouse down the road, the only other building with enough space and warmth. Cal followed behind like a man being led to trial, unsure if what he'd just done was enough to balance the scales. Part of him still expected a rope or a cell. Inside the schoolhouse, Lenora laid the girls down on a table lined with wool blankets. Cal hovered nearby, rubbing the burn on his arm absent-mindedly. One of the older women from town was mixing something on the stove, milk, maybe, or a kind of broth. Nobody told him to leave, but nobody spoke to him either. Finally, Lenora turned. "You saved her." He nodded. "But I left them alone. You went for them. That matters more." He sank into a chair, staring at the girls. Lydia was quiet now, thumb in her mouth. Rose was still pink-faced, eyes squeezed shut. But they were safe. For now. That night, the sheriff returned. He didn't come with handcuffs or threats. Just a flask of water and a folded piece of paper. "Got your name cleared?" Cal looked up, blinking. "What?" "Telegram from Clearwater. The man you were accused of killing? Turns out he showed up last week, drunk and bragging about how he pinned a killing on someone else to dodge a debt. They sent the message yesterday. You're a free man." Cal didn't speak. He couldn't. "I don't know what your plans are," the sheriff went on, "but you got choices now. You can stay here, start over, or you can ride out." "Do I still owe for the horse?" The sheriff cracked a smile. "She's yours. Looks like she's taken to you anyway." He left without another word. For the first time in years, Cal felt something settle in his chest. A kind of silence that wasn't fear or guilt, just quiet. Stillness. Freedom. But peace in Hollow Creek was short-lived. 2 days after the fire, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, sealed with wax, and delivered by a courier who didn't speak more than 5 words. He just handed it to Sister Lenora and rode off. She read it once, then again. Her hands shook. When she finally passed it to Cal, her voice was hollow. "You need to see this." The letter was addressed to the Keeper of the Children, written in flowing script with an unfamiliar hand. It read, "The girls are not yours to keep. You found them, yes, but they were placed where they were for a reason. Return them to the edge of Riker's Hollow within 5 days, or we will come for them, and we do not make idle threats." Cal read it twice, 3 times. His jaw clenched. "Who in the world?" he started. "I don't know," Lenora said, her face pale. "But they know we have them, and they're not just making threats. They're watching." "Riker's Hollow," Cal muttered. "That's 2 days north. Empty land. No town. No people." "Exactly," Lenora said. "Which means if we go there, we don't come back." Cal folded the letter and slipped it into his coat. The girls were asleep again, unaware of the storm that had just shifted. "We're not giving them up," he said quietly. "No," Lenora said, steel in her voice. "We're not." Over the next 2 days, Cal didn't sleep. He watched every shadow, spent hours scanning the hills from the edge of town, and every time he looked down at Lydia or Rose, something inside him tightened. These weren't just children anymore. They were his line in the sand. His reason. He'd stolen a horse and found 2 newborns. Now he had something worth dying for, and someone out there wanted to take it all away. He sharpened his old knife, cleaned the rifle he hadn't touched since before Clearwater, dug the bullet out of the floorboard of the church ruins, the one that hadn't missed him, only spared him. The town started to rally without needing to be asked. Someone brought wood for a new shelter. Someone else started sewing new clothes for the girls. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now nodded as he passed. But still, the 5th day crept closer. And Cal knew in his bones, whoever had written that letter. They were already coming. The 5th day began without sunlight. The storm had rolled in heavy through the night, dragging thick clouds that blotted out the moon, pressing down on Hollow Creek like the sky itself had. Something to grieve. Snow fell in sheets, not gently, but driven and sharp. The wind screamed across the empty hills, scattering the sound of horses' hooves long before they reached the edge of town. Cal had not slept. He hadn't let the fire in the schoolhouse die. Nor had he taken his boots off. He sat at the window, one eye on the tree line, one hand resting on the rifle across his knees. Rose and Lydia lay nestled in a cradle pulled from what was left of the church, two little bundles swaddled in wool and prayers. Lenora came in quietly, her arms wrapped around herself, a shawl pulled tight. She looked thinner than ever in the cold light, but her voice was steady. "They'll come today." Cal didn't respond. He knew. The kind of men who wrote letters like that didn't bluff. She moved closer, laid a small hand on his shoulder. "The townsfolk are ready. Some of them are armed, others are just willing. They shouldn't have to fight for this," Cal muttered. "This is my mess." "No," she said. "You found them. But they belong to all of us now." He turned, finally meeting her eyes. "What if they're right? What if someone wants them back because they belong to something dangerous?" She didn't flinch. "Then we protect them anyway." The knock came at midday. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. 3 quick raps on the schoolhouse door, sharp and deliberate, like punctuation at the end of a long warning. Cal stood slowly. He motioned to Lenora, who gathered the girls and stepped into the back room. Then he opened the door. A man stood alone on the other side, but it was clear he wasn't truly alone. Shapes shifted behind him in the snow, mounted and waiting. 6 riders, maybe more, all draped in dark coats, hats low, rifles visible, holsters heavy. But it was the man at the door who demanded all attention. He was tall and lean, but not sickly. His eyes were the color of slate, cold and unblinking, and his face was marked by an old scar that split his upper lip, dragging his smile sideways. "You Cal Ridley?" "I am." The man nodded. "I'm here for the children." "Why?" "They don't belong to you. They don't belong to anyone who'd leave them chained to a rail." The man's smile didn't move. "They weren't meant for you. They were meant for something greater." "What kind of something leaves babies to die in the snow?" "You wouldn't understand." Cal shifted, bringing the rifle a little closer. "Try me." The man glanced around. "We could take them. By force. You could try." "But we won't. Not yet. I was sent to offer you a deal." "No deal," Cal said. "They stay. You don't even know who they are." "They're children." "They're more than that," the man said, voice tightening. "They were born under signs, in blood. They were meant for a covenant older than this town. Older than you." Cal's jaw tightened. "Sounds like superstition." The man stepped closer. "You think this is about folklore? You think we don't know what we're doing? Look around you, Outlaw. Look what's happened since you took them in. The fire, the letters. That was just a taste." "If you come near them again," Cal said slowly, "I won't just fight. I'll end you." The man studied him, then nodded once. "Then you'll have to deal with what comes." He turned without another word and walked back into the snow. His men wheeled their horses, following him toward the trees. In moments, they were gone. But Cal didn't relax. He stepped outside, scanning the ridgeline. He could feel it in the air. Something was waiting, watching. That man hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to buy time. At sunset, the first fire started. It wasn't in the town. It was in the woods, plumes of smoke rising from the old storage barn by the creek, a place used mostly for hay and broken tools. Someone had lit it as a warning. By midnight, the stables went up. Cal and 3 others managed to get the horses out before they burned, but it was a close thing. A shadow moved near the north fence, and Cal fired once, but the figure vanished before he could be sure of the hit. They weren't attacking to win. They were testing, probing, letting the town know the noose was closing. The next morning, they found tracks leading to the well behind the schoolhouse. Someone had poisoned the rope bucket with lye. The girls were fine. Lenora had been drawing water from her own kettle, but it was a message. We can reach you whenever we want. By the third day, the town was ready for war. Barricades went up across the main road. Hunting rifles were cleaned, bullets divided. Even the pastor's son, barely 16, took up a post near the grain silo with a pistol in hand. People weren't trained soldiers, but they were angry and afraid, and sometimes that was enough. Cal stood on the roof of the schoolhouse wrapped in his old coat, watching the snow settle. He hadn't left the building in 2 days, except to gather firewood. Lenora stayed close to the girls, teaching them the sound of her voice, keeping their little hands warm, singing hymns to cover the sound of hammering outside. He looked at them, now through the window, 2 tiny lives, blinking up at a world already cruel. He wondered, not for the first time, what kind of people would come after infants. What kind of twisted devotion or greed drove a man to believe babies were currency? That night, they came again, but this time they didn't knock. Gunfire shattered the dark. It started on the west end of town, a single shot, then another, then a chorus of chaos. Horses screamed, men shouted. Somewhere, a bell clanged once, then fell silent. Cal dropped from the roof, rifle slung, boots slamming into the snow. He didn't wait for instructions. He ran. The first wave had already breached the barricade. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they moved with eerie precision. Covered faces, matching coats, rifles held military style. They didn't speak, just moved, shot, set fire. One man reached the church ruins and began pouring oil on what was left of the altar. Cal caught him in the shoulder with a shot, and he dropped, twitching. More came. It wasn't a raid. It was an execution, but the townsfolk held. They poured from buildings with hunting gear, pitchforks, anything they could swing. Old men fired from porches. Mothers threw rocks from rooftops. It wasn't elegant, but it was desperate, and desperation had teeth. Cal found himself back near the schoolhouse as the second wave hit. They came straight for it. 2 riders, sabers drawn, pistols, blazing. He took one down with a shot to the chest. The other nearly made it to the porch, but Lenora stepped out with a shotgun and fired. The rider spun off his mount like a rag doll. They didn't come again that night, but the message was clear. This was far from over, and somewhere out in the dark. The man with the scarred lip was waiting, watching, letting the pieces move just as he wanted. In the morning, they found something nailed to the barn door, a symbol, drawn in blood, 2 circles overlapping, with a mark in the center, an eye, unblinking. Beneath it, a single word. Return them. Cal stood for a long time staring at it. He didn't know what force these men served, didn't know if it was madness or something worse, but he knew this. He wasn't giving those girls up, not now, not ever, even if it meant burning the whole world to the ground to keep them safe. The blood on the barn door froze by mid-morning, turning dark and cracked in the cold. No one dared clean it. Not yet. No one even spoke of it aloud, as if naming it would make the evil stronger. The symbol remained there, watching, etched deep into the wood, as if it had grown from within. Cal stood before it longer than he meant to, his breath clouding in the air, rifle across his back, thoughts running faster than he could hold. Behind him, inside the schoolhouse, the girls slept in a cradle lined with blankets and warmth and prayers, unaware that the town beyond those walls was preparing for war a second time. Lenora had moved them to the smallest room, farthest from any window, and posted 3 townsfolk to guard the building in shifts. None of them questioned Cal's leadership anymore. He hadn't asked for it. He'd just stepped into it like it was always waiting for him. "They're not going to wait long," said Ruthie, the blacksmith's widow, coming up beside him at the barn. Her hands were red with cold, wrapped in half-burned gloves, but she held her shotgun steady. "Men like that don't bluff." "I know," Cal said. "We've got 1 more night, maybe 2. They'll come heavy this time. They want those babies." "Then we'll hold heavy." She nodded, then pointed at the symbol. You ever seen anything like that? Only in nightmares. The truth was, something about the symbol stirred a memory in Cal, something buried deep, long before. He was an outlaw, long before the cards turned cold, a preacher in Arkansas, half mad with fever, shouting about circles in the dark and children born with old souls. Cal hadn't believed it then. He barely remembered the man's face now, but he remembered the fear in his voice, the way people had backed away from the sermon like it might catch fire. Inside the schoolhouse, Lenora was feeding Lydia while Rose slept, their tiny limbs slow and warm. She sang softly, the same hymn her mother had sung to her, something about angels watching low and high. Her voice cracked in the cold, but she didn't stop. She didn't let herself cry either. There was no room for that anymore. Cal joined her. After sunset, she glanced up and saw something new in his face, not fear, but a kind of decision. "What is it?" she asked. "They're coming tonight. All of them." She nodded. "You're sure?" He stepped closer, brushing his fingers against Lydia's hand. "They want them now. They're not going to wait until we're ready. The last attack was just pressure. Tonight is the real storm." "Then we stand, he agreed. "But if something happens to me—" "No." Her voice sharpened. "Don't start that. You need to know what to do. I already do." He looked at her then, really looked, at the woman who'd stayed in a half-burned town, who'd stepped in front of gunfire with a shotgun she barely knew how to use, who'd kept singing lullabies while the world outside cracked. "They're not just mine anymore," he said. "They're yours too." Lenora reached out and touched his chest. "They were never just yours. They were never just found. They were given. To you. To us." He kissed her forehead and stepped away, not trusting himself to say anything more. Outside, the townsfolk gathered. Every man and woman who could hold a weapon took position. Behind windows, along rooftops, behind crates and barrels and broken fences. Snow fell again, thick and heavy, covering footprints as fast as they were made. It muffled the world until only breathing remained. And then, the horn. A long, low wail that didn't sound like any signal Cal had ever heard. It came from the trees, from the dark, echoing through the hills like a wolf's cry stretched thin. Figures emerged like shadows with teeth. Not a dozen, not 20, 50, maybe more. Some on horseback, some on foot, all clad in black, all with that same symbol drawn across their coats, their hats, their weapons. Not one of them spoke. Not one shouted a warning. They moved like ghosts sent to finish what flesh could not. The first bullet broke the silence. Cal didn't know who fired it, didn't care. It hit the shoulder of a man in front and sent him reeling, but the others didn't flinch. They just moved faster, tighter, more like a wave than an army. The schoolhouse was their target, and Cal was the tide. He moved through the town like a storm, firing once, twice, always moving. The others followed his lead, flanking, circling, shooting from windows and alleyways. It wasn't war. It was something uglier, closer. Men grappling in the snow, knives flashing, screams swallowed by wind. No speeches, no declarations. Just the raw will to protect. They reached the schoolhouse porch. Cal met them there. The man with the scarred lip came forward again, coat unbuttoned, snow collecting on his shoulders. "This is your last chance," he said. "You already had yours." The man sighed. They weren't meant to be raised by common hands. They carry something old, something divine. Then God will decide where they belong. "No," the man said, and for the first time his voice cracked. "God left this matter to us." He lunged. The world became smoke and thunder. Cal's rifle snapped up and fired. The man jerked but didn't fall. A second shot took his knee. Still, he crawled, snarling. Cal kicked the rifle away and drew his knife, stepping between the door and the crawling figure. Behind him, he could hear Lenora screaming. Lydia, wailing now, rose too. The door burst open, and someone dragged Cal back. It was Ruthie. "Go!" she screamed. "Get to the girls!" He turned, stumbling inside as bullets ripped through the front of the schoolhouse. The back room was already broken, glass shattered, wind screaming through the cracks. Lenora held both girls crouched low. "They're coming through the side," Callie slammed the door shut and slid a desk against it. "Out the back! There is no back!" she cried. "The walls collapsed." Then the horn blew again. But this time, it didn't come from the woods. It came from the ridge. Dozens of riders burst over the hill, not cloaked in black, but wrapped in tan dusters, rifles held high. Led by a man with white hair and a gold star, pinned to his chest, Sheriff Miles Granger, the cavalry. They poured into the town with fury, shouting warnings, picking off black-clad attackers one by one. Cal could barely believe his eyes. Lenora sobbed in relief. "How?" "I don't know," Cal muttered. "I sent a letter 3 weeks ago before all this started, just in case. I never heard back. Thought maybe they'd burned the mail." Outside, the tide turned. The black-cloaked figures broke formation. Some ran. Some dropped their weapons. Sheriff Granger himself leapt from his horse and stormed the schoolhouse, gun blazing. He pulled Cal out of the way of a flying hatchet and fired point-blank into the attacker's chest. "I thought you were dead, Ridley. I thought you weren't coming." The sheriff grinned. "Got your letter. Rode 30 miles through frozen hell. Figured I owed you after Dry Creek. You still do." Another rider appeared, this one leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. Others chased the fleeing attackers through the hills. By dawn, it was over. Snow covered the bodies. Smoke drifted from a few smouldering homes. But the worst had passed. Cal sat on the schoolhouse steps, his coat wrapped around Lydia, who refused to sleep. Lenora rocked Rose nearby, her hands shaking too hard to braid the child's hair. Sheriff Granger stood over the blood-marked barn door and shook his head. "You know what that is?" "I don't want to." "I do. My grandfather talked about it. Said it was a mark of a forgotten order. Said some folks thought they could raise prophets through fire, that they could choose who was chosen." Cal looked up. "You think it's over?" "No," Granger said softly. "But I think you bought them time. Might be enough." Lenora joined them, both girls now quiet in her arms. "What do we do now?" Cal looked at her, at the twins, at the sky finally clearing overhead. "We stay ready. We teach them love. And if the dark comes back, we stand again." No one argued, not because it was easy, but because it was right, and because sometimes the most dangerous kind of man is the one with nothing left to lose but the lives he's sworn to protect. Winter finally loosened its grip in slow inches, first in the air, which no longer bit so sharply at the skin, then in the earth, where snow thawed to reveal half-frozen grass and forgotten footprints. But in the town of Harrow's Hollow, nothing melted faster than silence. The town had been quiet for months after the raid, as if it too had gone into mourning. But now that spring whispered its promises through the wind, voices returned, hammers on roofs, laughter near the well, a song drifting from the schoolhouse. Not everyone had made it through, but those who had clung tighter to life, to each other, and especially to the 2 baby girls who had changed everything. Cal had stopped thinking of himself as an outlaw, not because the world forgave him, but because the girls had. Every day with them, he rewrote his name. Not in ink or in legend, but in the way Lydia reached for his beard with her tiny hand, or the way Rose smiled in her sleep when he hummed the same tune every night. They didn't know the man he had been. They only knew the man who held them now. Still, peace was not something Cal trusted easily. It wasn't in his nature. He kept one rifle by the door, another in the cradle's false bottom. He mapped escape routes in his head, even while changing diapers. And when Sheriff Granger rode out with the rest of his men 2 weeks after the raid, Cal stood outside and watched them go like a man watching the last train leave before the sky breaks open. "You sure you'll stay?" Granger had asked him that morning, reins tight in his hand. "I made a promise." The sheriff had nodded. "You'll need more than that, Ridley, but it's a start." He rode off without waiting for a reply. Now, in the schoolhouse, Cal moved like a man who had learned stillness, not by choice, but by necessity. The girls were 6 months old. Lenora had taken to calling them the twins, like they were some natural event like thunder or wind, as if their names were still too fragile to speak too often. But to Cal, Lydia and Rose were anchors. Even on the quietest mornings, something always reminded him it wasn't over. Sometimes it was the dreams. Waking in a cold sweat, breath caught in his throat, the barn door bleeding again in memory. Sometimes it was the flicker of a shadow across a window that wasn't supposed to be open, or a traveller in town who asked one too many questions about the children. The cult hadn't vanished, it had only retreated. Granger confirmed it with a letter that arrived on the back of a tired pony, wrapped in oilskin and stamped with his star. The letter said they'd found other barns, other marks, other children. Some missing, some dead, some saved. But the group, whoever they were, had gone underground. He looked back at the town, small, battered, defiant. "I used to think I was cursed," he said. "Everywhere I went, something burned, someone bled. And now? Now, I think I was just lost." And they were the map. Below, the wind stirred the trees. An owl hooted once, then went silent. Somewhere near the barn, a candle flickered to life in the window, casting soft light on the crib just inside. "They're going to change everything," Lenora whispered. Cal nodded. "They already did." He took her hand. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the scars, not even the coming threat. All that existed were 2 sleeping girls, a town stitched back together with hope, and the man who would never let either fall again. Because sometimes the greatest outlaws die unknown, but the greatest fathers live forever.